Good evening to you all and welcome to tonight's Melbourne Conversation. Tonight is Service Before Self, stories that bind our communities. Could I first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we gather tonight, the members of the great Kulin Nation, and pay my deep personal respects to their elders past and present, and thank their elders, particularly those of the Wurundjeri, whose lands these are, for the work that they do throughout our community as we meet here tonight. Could I remind you that although we're a very young city, founded only in 1835, our First Peoples are the oldest continuous culture in the world, and I think that acknowledgement is an important gesture towards reconciliation, and I'm always very happy to make it. We've got a Melbourne Conversation tonight developed in collaboration with IPA as part of their inaugural Public Sector Week. And what we're trying to do is showcase the work of our public sector in Victoria. This is one of more than 90 events taking place across our city and our state this week. It's supported by our very long-standing venue partner, Federation Square, and future leaders. I've spent a long time in public life and I've always believed in the importance and the integrity of Victoria's public sector and the skill and the dedication of our public servants. It's been a hallmark of my life professionally, probably for the last 25 years. I've worked in state and local governments, and I believe that our dedicated public servants have shaped not only our state, but also our city with their hard work and their dedication. They've made an immense contribution, not always recognised, and I think that that deserves recognition during this week. So I'm going to introduce to you a bit later on three people who are from the coalface of our public service, people who actually do that work that keep the wheels rolling. From Transport, Tara Piazza is Director of the Network Transformation Program at PTV Victoria and Director of the Board of Directors at the Institute for Breathing and Sleep. From Sustainability, so obviously from Transport. From Sustainability, Danielle Thomas is at City of Melbourne. Danielle has been a Park Ranger Coordinator and a Park Ranger for 12 years. And from Health, Dan Hadley is a Nurse Unit Manager in the Intensive Care Unit at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. Three people from the coalface, but also two very experienced people in public service. Two friends, I must confess, of mine, Terry Moran AC and Barry Cassidy. I do count Terry as a friend and I believe he is Australia's most distinguished public servant. That will really embarrass him, which gives me great pleasure. Great pleasure. He's been a Secretary of Premier and Cabinet in Victoria and a Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet in Canberra. A remarkable career. Someone uniquely placed to consider the public sector and the role of public servants. And Barry Cassidy, who's also a mate, someone who understands both the media and the political process. He's been a commentator on those processes for decades. Not quite an insider, but someone who certainly knows the insiders. And I'm delighted that Barry has also agreed to join us. I'm going to ask Terry Moran first about the public service and what do people think? You know, if we look at the wider community, what do people think about the public service as an initial comment? Terry.
Thanks, Lord Mayor. It's perhaps not going to be the character of the evening that lots of numbers are put on the table, but I thought I'd start out by mentioning a few because they tend to run against the prevailing view about the public sector in Australia. If you listened only to politicians, or at least not all, but many politicians, you'd think that the public sector was threadbare of talent, was an excessive burden on the taxpayers, and basically got in the way of doing the things that needed to be done. The truth is that measured as a proportion of gross domestic product, Australia's public sector is close to the smallest in the developed world, in the OECD world. That in 30 years we've seen the proportion of the total workforce employed within the public sector decline from 25% to 16% of the total workforce. And in surveys that go back as far as the 80s, for instance, Gary Morgan's surveys on honesty and integrity, the occupations and professions that are best regarded are overwhelmingly the frontline service delivery occupations in the public sector, and indeed are consistently more highly rated than any other occupational profession is nursing. So we'll hear a bit about that in a minute. But interestingly, more recently, the University of Technology Sydney has undertaken a very extensive survey of what people in the community around Australia think about local government. And despite the fact that I've got a strong commitment to the public sector and to the public service in particular, even I was surprised at how upbeat and positive were the results. And this won't take more than a moment, but I just thought I'd mention some of them. So in a sample of 2,000 people, which is a bigger sample than most opinion polling would use, 75% of Australians surveyed think local government is best able to make decisions about their local area. This compares to 26% for state government and a rather embarrassing 2% for the national government. There's an emotional connection between people and the place where they live, and this is one of the strongest messages that the people who did the survey think should come out of the survey for the attention of policymakers. And the concept of service delivery by the public service is important to Australians. And in the survey it was found that 93% of the respondents want governments to play a role rather than the private sector in providing services to the community. And over 61% of those who responded disagree that government should focus on providing only basic services, and only 18% agreed with that proposition. The most trusted institutions are in the public sector, including the ABC, but also the High Court and the Reserve Bank in Australia, amongst many others. And sadly, the people that often criticise the public sector so much are down the bottom in terms of perceptions of honesty, integrity, trust, and respect for the institutions within which they operate. Therefore, we sort of have treasures, in my view, at the local level delivering services. And my final point would be that the direction of reform in the public sector at the moment, how do we make it even better, is to put even more and more authority at the local level. And in that debate and pursuing that agenda, Victoria has for some time and remains the leading state. We've given more authority to public hospitals, to schools, to TAFEs, and to other outlets. And as a result, we find that we've got more innovation at the local level, we're more efficient at the local level, and people are happier at the local level. We can do better, but it's a good news story, and compared to the rest of the world, it's a fabulously good news story about Australia, but most particularly about Victoria.
I'm pretty tempted to close down the whole debate now and just say thank you very much for coming and all the very best, therefore all is good. But I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to go to Barry Cassidy, because Barry has been a commentator with access to politicians at the very highest level, and therefore the people who advise those politicians. And although he has a unique insight and insider view, he is outside the system, but has observed the system for all of his professional life. So Barry, let me toss to you. What are your reflections on the senior politicians that you've interviewed, the support that they've got, the public service and what they deliver for the people of Australia? Just give us a general world view.
Well, I've been a journalist for 47 years, and that will surprise a lot of you because I don't look 47, but in that 47 years, 18 years was in the private sector and almost 30 years at the ABC. So I think I've got a sense of how it works from both sides. Journalism is, per se, a public service, no matter which sector you work in, because you're gathering information on behalf of others, you're asking the questions, you're putting the pressure on those who need to be accountable in the community. How politicians respond to that, of course, can differ depending on whether you work in the public sector or the private sector. They feel as if they have a stake in the public sector, and therefore they think that we should be more vulnerable often to that sort of pressure. Why do I regard that as so important, though, that we have a strong public sector and that we have a very strong ABC, is because in the private sector, of course, profit is the motive. And as they come under more pressure financially, that is more and more the case. Those of you who might read The Australian regularly probably recognise there's a bit of a campaign that runs against the ABC almost on a daily basis. Now, you can understand why that is the case. It's because an organisation publicly funded like the ABC takes listeners away from their radio networks, it takes viewers away from Sky to the ABC, it takes readers away from their online efforts. And so it threatens their business model. So you can understand why that kind of pressure is there. But I would argue that to have an organisation that is not compromised and that is free of all of that is absolutely essential in a democracy. I'll give you one example that in my dealings with politicians, and I know in editors' dealings with prime ministers, there's an arrangement that goes on where, and this is particularly at the federal level, where politicians trade favourable coverage for stories. And I'll give you one example of a Prime Minister at Kirribilli House at a Christmas party put it to an editor of a major newspaper and said, "What do I have to do to get a fair go?" And the editor said, "You have to start giving us stories." And this Prime Minister said, "I asked for a fair go, not a favourable go. I've got to give you stories just to get a fair go." But that kind of thing is not uncommon. I think it compromises and almost corrupts the system because editors are so obsessed by the need for breaking stories and fresh stories and exclusive stories, and so all sorts of deals are done. Now, the ABC can't do that. We can't engage in that sort of a practice. So I think that's just one example, I think, of how you know through the ABC that you're going to get the real deal. Just picking up on the figures that Terry mentioned, in fact, the ABC does come in number 2 behind the High Court in terms of trust and credibility out of all the institutions in the country. There was a poll out just today by Essential Research that asked the question about the media right across the board, and the ABC came in number 1 ahead of all of the other media organisations, and we're at 64% in terms of credibility and believability. So, thank you. But that
was confected applause, but perhaps we'll come back to that later.
So look, it is a tough time for the private sector and the media. I know that when I travel on trains, I always look around and in a carriage of 50 or 60 people, I take particular notice of how many people are reading a newspaper, and usually I'm the only one. Now, a lot of them are on their devices, and they might be reading a news website, or they might be looking at Facebook and picking up, consuming news in their own way. But the newspapers are just about history, and so they are struggling under the old business model. In my view, they moved way too slowly online, and they allowed the ABC to get ahead of them on that. That's not our fault, that's theirs. But in any case, times are changing for them. It's tough, and so the ABC, because of that, is coming under pressure. But in my view, even though those of us at the ABC are probably more insecure than we've ever been, and we've just had 1 in 10 retrenched over the last 6 months, and that's a lot, I still think the professionalism, and as I say, I've been there for 2 terms now, but covering 30 years, and I don't think it's ever been a more competent and a more professional place to work. So I'm proud, along with these guys here, to regard myself as a public servant.
Barry, thank you. Barry mentioned earlier when he was talking to us about the private sector, and it was a comment I made last night when we opened Public Sector Week. If you're in the private sector, it's very easy to measure how successful you are. It's your share price, it's your bottom line, it's your profit and loss. There are other elements for sure, but they're the real indicators of how well you're doing. In the public sector, it is so much more difficult. How do you measure what Professor Mark Moore from the Harvard School of Government calls public value? The thing that public servants do. And that's what I want to get to tonight, not so much in terms of measurability, but in terms of stories, and having you hear from 3 people who are very passionate and at the front line of what they do. And I promise you, if I interrupt them during their stories, I've actually okayed that with them. I'm not being rude, I promise you. Let me start with Tara, and Tara, of course, is at PTV. And I'm going to ask each of our 3 coalface workers the same very, very difficult first question. And to Tara, I'm going to say, tell us what you do.
Thank you very much. My role at PTV, and I'll do my best to explain, is I lead a team, about 100 people across PTV, and I work with all of the operators in public transport, so Yarra Trams, V-Line, Metro Trains, and there's several bus operators, and we introduce changes to the timetable. So you might like to hate me, but my job is to make sure that that happens as best that it can. My job is to work with all of the engineers, so PTV and the operators have a lot of engineers, and they like to work with logistics, and they like to work out how many trams could fit in on one route in the most effective time, and how can we make the best use of the funding that the government provides. But my job is to make sure that we understand what that means for the customer, and what does that mean for the people that catch the tram, what does that mean for the people that catch the train, and making sure that it's actually a service that all of us want to use. There's no point having trains running if nobody wants to catch them because they're going to a place nobody wants to go. So I coordinate across agencies and I advocate for the customer, and I make sure that things like on Sunday we opened the Regional Rail Link, which is a very exciting, it's the event, it's the biggest change to public transport in the last 80 years in Victoria, and it was my role to coordinate that for our industry and to bring that to fruition for customers. So it's a busy role, and I really like to make sure that the customers' needs are well understood and best represented within PTV and the operators.
Dara, can you tell us, when most people think about public transport, they think they're great. I think it's fantastic when I'm on the number one tram, but a lot of people say if they're travelling from a long way out, why is it that the buses and the trams don't coordinate with the trains so that it's a seamless system across all modes? Is that part of your work as well?
It is. It's a very good question.
Oh, thank you.
And not one that we...
The next one will be much easier for you.
That's right. So in the past, public transport in Victoria has been treated as modes independent of one another, but part of my role and why I'm now at PTV is to create that integrated approach. So part of what we did on the weekend when we launched the rail services was to launch also a whole lot of connecting bus services, so that for people that live in Werribee and would like to catch a new train from Wyndham Vale, that they can get on the bus that will take them to Wyndham Vale to catch the train. So that's an absolutely crucial step forward and part of our strategy at PTV to create an integrated transport network.
We don't use our water very well, do we?
Not really. I think we have 2 ferry services, and
Yeah.
one of them is at French Island, which gets shut down in the case of inclement weather like
In winter.
Monday. That's right.
Winter on French Island.
That's right.
That's 8 months of the year.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And tell me, of all of the modalities, where is our future? You know, when I think now, when we think about the centre of the city, we have on a quiet day 840,000 people come into the centre of the city. On a busy day or in the future, it's going to be 1 million people coming into the centre of the city. How are we going to move them? What's the transport of the future?
Well, I think it's about a balanced plan. And so what we're looking at is what are the drivers in regional Victoria and what are the growth corridors in regional Victoria, and therefore what are the demands on our V-Line services, and then looking within Greater Melbourne and what are the demands on the metropolitan train system and on our tram network, and how should the buses work to support our heavy and light rail. So really I don't think that the future is in one particular mode, but it's about the planned growth across all modes to make sure that people get to where they need to be and when they need to be there.
An amateur's view of transport. When I look at transport, I look at heavy rail, and I think it's essentially spokes. These were people who were coming into the centre of the city from outer suburbs. And I look at the tram network, the biggest tram network in the world, and the world's most livable city. Great for short haul, but I wouldn't want to get on a tram to go to Narre Warren, I wouldn't think. How do we connect the city, not in spokes in towards the centre, but more in cycles outside the city? And are buses the answer? Because I'm a bit out of date here, but buses weren't terribly popular 10 years ago. People weren't using them because they thought they were a bit inflexible.
That's right. So what we're looking at is how customers use the bus network. We have a few we call them smart buses, but if you like, they're a premium service, and we are looking at the moment, we're evaluating that and looking to see how we can expand and improve that network to provide those essential connections that you're talking about.
Are we the worst fare evaders in the world?
Fare evasion is at an all-time low in Victoria at the moment.
No, don't give me. No, come on, Tara, don't give me. We're not working for the organisation here. Are we among the worst fare evaders in the world?
I think we used to be, but it has improved significantly. So particularly on the tram network, it is significantly better, and we're not the worst anymore. There are other countries that are much
So we're
worse
ahead
than
of
us.
Namibia now.
No, I think we're on par with developed countries.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's caused that change?
It's been a combination of efforts. Part of it is about customer change, and part of it is about people understanding that they do need to pay for the services that they use, and so that there's been an uplift in fare compliance. There is a little bit about enforcement, but predominantly within Victoria, it's about the general public paying for the services that they use. It's not really about any extra big sticks being used.
Now, a very, very easy question to conclude for you, Tara. Mikey, good thing, bad thing?
I don't think I'm allowed to tell you what I really think.
No, that's a very, very good answer. That's a fine answer. Thank you. My view is it needs a bit more flexibility, particularly for day tickets and visitors, but that's a different issue. Tell us what's the biggest challenge of your job?
The biggest challenge is trying to deliver services that suit everybody. And
Well, you can't do that, mate. Suit everybody.
That's right. Well, it's very hard to, within a limited funding envelope from government, to deliver services that everybody's happy with. And so it is, and it's difficult having those conversations with people that may be disadvantaged by a change, and it's difficult to try and find that balance of if we need to put in a new bus stop to service a new estate, but the person who lives in the house where the bus stop will go doesn't like the bus stop in front of their house, and they get the angle grinder out, which happened just on the weekend. They cut down the bus pole and they drive it to the city council office and deposit it on the front doorstep. And
You've got to admire that. To be honest, as a statement, I understand your predicament, but you've got to admire that as a statement.
Oh yes, it's very effective. So it's, I get the emails saying this has happened, and it's really difficult. How do you balance the needs of the broader community, of all the people that want that bus stop, with the couple of people who don't want the bus stop?
Hey, mate, bus stops. Try public toilets. I can tell you about public toilets and how that works. Anyway, look, the final question for Tara, and we'll go back to her later, and this is something I asked Tara whether she'd be comfortable to answer. Tara's mother died in a car crash in 2006, and I think that would be described as a defining moment in your life. Can you tell us how your work ethic has been influenced by personal tragedy?
Sure. So I've always been a very hard worker, and my parents, and my mother included, absolutely instilled in me a very strong work ethic. But after she died, not immediately, but probably about 18 months later, and I was working in financial services at the time, it began to dawn on me that there needed to be more, and I wanted to be doing more than working in corporate world, as glamorous and hard as it was. And I started to look for opportunities outside of that, and I felt like I needed to contribute more and add value in a different way than in financial services. So I made the decision to explore opportunities, and Victoria Police at the time were looking for organisational change specialists, which is what I do. And as a civilian, I joined Victoria Police. And that was in part because it was a really interesting role in terms of introducing change into Victoria Police, but also because I believe very strongly with the values of the organisation, and it was a way in which I could contribute much more strongly back to the community and get more satisfaction out of my work. And one of the roles that I ended in Victoria Police was reducing the road toll. And so from a strategic level, identifying opportunities in which we can save lives on our roads. And obviously that's very dear to my heart, as I don't want other families to go through what my family did.
Can you thank Tara, please? But you're not off the hook, we'll come back to you. Let's go to Danielle. Danielle is one of our rangers. and you would have no idea what a ranger does. But Danielle's about to tell us. Tell us what you do, Danielle.
Okay, so I am the Park Ranger Coordinator with City of Melbourne. I've been working here for 12 years. We have 160 or so parks, gardens and reserves across the city, which a lot of people probably aren't aware of. And I manage a team of 6 rangers. We work from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. sometimes, 7 days a week. So we do all sorts of jobs. We don't generally do all of the hard yakka. So we have a team of gardeners and arborists and you name it, contractors who do all of the hard work, physical hard work I should say, and we assist with the management of that team. We also oversee what's happening in the parks and gardens, so we are the protectors of the parks. Effectively, we're making sure everybody is doing the right thing in the right place and the right time. We're not heavy enforcement officers. We are the friendly education officers, I suppose is what we call ourselves. And we call ourselves the Park Ranger Service because that's what we do. We provide a service to everybody. So whether it be our contractors, whether it be other members of council or just the everyday person that's using the parks and gardens, we make sure everybody's playing sport in the right place at the right time. We look after any kind of incident that might happen in the park, so any kind of critical response, if it's police, fire brigade, ambulance. We work a lot with our community services department on dealing with homelessness issues, which is, tends to be a daily occurrence for us in the parks and gardens. We also do animal rescue, and there's not a lot, I suppose, that we don't do. We respond to any incident at any time, which can be difficult with only 6 staff working over a 7-day week. And it's an interesting job. It's a job that myself and all of my rangers absolutely love to do, but you do deal with all sorts of interesting and bizarre things, in particular in relation to a lot of events. There's a lot of major events in the city, but there's also more weddings in Melbourne than I think anyone would ever realise. I think the most I've seen is 17 in one park on one day, so it can be...
Which park?
That was Fitzroy Gardens.
Fitzroy Gardens?
Yeah, we counted...
We've got to increase the fees for weddings in Fitzroy Gardens, obviously.
I think we have. We did count 47 brides in the gardens on that day, having photos taken.
What? 47 brides, 17 weddings, so 30 of them were not paying?
No,
That's
well...
outrageous.
They weren't getting married, they were just having photos taken. But,
different issue.
You know. We also provide an education service, which is pretty dear to my heart. I started a...
Hang on, let me ask you about this.
Yep.
Before we get on to the education thing, this is a whole little story. I hope that Danielle's about to tell you that you wouldn't think of being in the purview of a park ranger, but I hope she's about to tell you the story of St Michael's College in North Melbourne and what happened there. Am I right or completely wrong?
No, I can tell you that story.
Tell us the St Michael's story in North Melbourne. By the way, St Michael's in North Melbourne is a school where 98% of the students are not native English-speaking students. They come from difficult cultures and difficult nations from around the world. It's a particularly interesting school population. But Danielle.
They're a very interesting school, and I met one of their teachers at one of our tree planting days many years ago, and it actually took a couple of years for me to get an education program up and running with this school, because while they're opposite Royal Park and the Royal Children's Hospital as well, it's 8 lanes of traffic for them to get across to the park. So you imagine one teacher with all of those students, it's very difficult to get them to go across to the park. They've actually got to cross 6 tram tracks to get there. So it took a lot of work for me to be able to just physically be able to get them to leave the school and go to the park.
Sorry, Danielle, let me interrupt again. Remember also, these are children and families who come from a culture where a uniform turning up to say, we're here to help you, is not necessarily something that they trust. So even our park rangers in uniform were a very difficult hurdle for them to leap.
Yeah, look, absolutely. A lot of these children live in the Housing Commission within walking distance of Royal Park, which is a 170-hectare park, and yet these children don't go there, don't go with their parents, don't go there after school to play. They don't go there because a lot of the times in the countries that they come from, when you go to the park, something bad happens. So it took a lot of effort, and we had to visit...
Sorry, Danielle, or by the way, the park's not open to you. You know, the concept of a public park is foreign, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of these children believed that the park was part of the Royal Children's Hospital, or, it wasn't public open space. They didn't know that they could go there. They thought sometimes they could go to the Oval if there was enough teachers to help them out, but that was it. So after many years of trying, we eventually got the right teacher and the right principal and the right amount of park rangers with the right qualifications. And we started a program that related directly to their curriculum, which is quite difficult to do. It required us to get teachers to actually teach the rangers to make sure that we knew that what we were doing would relate directly to their curriculum, so the principal would allow them to go, let alone get permission from the parents to let them go. But it started a relationship with the school that's now 4 years old, and we run weekly sessions sometimes with these children. Taking them across to the park is the first hurdle, and then getting them to behave there is the second hurdle, which is I've had children lie down on tram tracks and throw pine cones at me and all sorts of things. But
Throw
after
what at you, sorry?
Pine cones. All sorts of things.
They bounce off.
Once children are
Come
in...
on, Danielle, toughen up. They bounce off.
I know. Once they're in open space and they're running wild, these children really did run wild. They come from a very small school. I think we worked out 7 out of 9 of them or something hadn't climbed trees before, which to me is quite an amazing figure. But these children, by the end of the term, their teachers were amazed. They had changed completely. They were much more attentive in class. A lot of them now want to work in the environmental field, which to us is quite amazing. They planted trees. Their families now start using the park, and they also informed the design of the park, which is really important to get the local community to work to inform the design of parks. So those of you that are familiar with Royal Park will know that right next to the Children's Hospital we recently opened a new play space, and those children, along with many others, I think something like 180, actually formed part of the consultation of what we ended up with. So a term-long program culminated in what they wanted to see in that park, which is quite amazing. And those children, of course, now go back to visit that park quite regularly. And they respect it, which is the most important thing. So they're not the only school we work with, but we work with many different schools on education programs. And we also work with kindergartens and a number of other non-English speaking groups. So an Indian play group, an African play group, a bunch of different groups around Melbourne to try and help them understand where the parks and gardens are. First and foremost, what facilities we offer. Let them know that it's safe to go there, and if we have to, give them our mobile phone number and say, when you get there, if there's a problem, call me, which I'm thankful to say actually none of them have ever done, but we've certainly had groups like an African women's walking group that it took me nearly a year to get them to go to Royal Park, and of course now they visit there weekly, in large groups, and they feel safe because the park rangers have told them what it is that we do, which, it's been a pretty rewarding experience to do that.
Tell us what your biggest challenges are.
Oh, getting around to 160 parks is a big challenge. Lucky a lot of us ride bikes, so we can get there and be visible. I think a lot of it is anticipating what's going to come up so that we have people in the right place at the right time, which can be difficult, which is why we sometimes work so early and late in the evening. But it really is, I suppose, knowing where it is that we're going to be needed, because you don't want to have someone on the wrong side of the city and have to pass in peak hour traffic to something that might happen somewhere else. And I suppose it might sound funny to a lot of people that we might be responding to something that's an emergency, but it does happen. And while we have a great team of contractors that work in the parks and gardens, we're the ones in uniform, we're the ones that are authorised officers, and we're the ones, I suppose, that often can get things done. And generally that's the way it goes. People call a ranger because we tend to know the people that get the job done.
Tell us some of the quirky things. What have they asked you for? What have you found?
What have I found? Oh, I've found all sorts of things. I think I've returned about 7 or 8 passports over the years, and I don't know how many mobile phones and keys and teddy bears, and you name it, I've returned them to people. Lots of strange things. I once had a really lovely homeless lady who was living in one of our parks and said she didn't want accommodation. And I said, what do you want? I want to help you in some way, and I want to connect you with the people that can assist you. And she said, I want a holiday. And I went, I'd love to help you with that, but I can't. And And I was really touched
You
by
could have
that.
taken her from Royal Park to Fitzroy
Yeah,
Gardens,
well,
perhaps.
she was actually living in Treasury Gardens at the
Oh,
time.
well, she was at the top of the tree, you know.
She had a very nice piece of real estate. But the rangers checked on her daily, and a number of times we'd had to call for help because of her welfare, and in the end we got her a haircut. That was the next best thing that she wanted.
That's a lovely thing to do. No, very important.
She looked better for it. She said she felt better for it.
Absolutely.
So it was one little thing that we could do to help her. And quite often it's those little things that you do. I was a witness at someone's wedding because the witness didn't show up. I picked flowers from the conservatory because the bride's flowers didn't arrive and she was in tears, and you do anything to help a bride, and I've probably done lots of things that people just go, you shouldn't do that as part of your job, but at the end of the day you want people to have an
You pick flowers from our conservatory for a bride who's bouquet.
Conservatory. I call it my conservatory. I've been told many times to stop calling them my parks.
Yeah,
but,
fair enough.
After 12 years, they feel like my parks.
Yeah.
What you've got to do to help people at the time, and especially on their special days, and it's quite lovely that people involve you in their special days as well, and you're part of people's lives. You see and a witness to all sorts of amazing things that happen in parks, because people go there for all different sorts of reasons. A lot of the times it's to celebrate, but a lot of the times, they're going there for their quiet moment, or, a number of the homeless people that will live in the park say we live here because we want to be in the great outdoors and it's beautiful and we don't cope well in other environments. And so you get to know them because they've been living in these areas for a long time. Often other people don't notice them because it might be in the shadows or at the back of, the back of a little park somewhere, but they're people that my staff can name and tell you their entire life story about. And we relay all of that through, City of Melbourne's community services and the Salvation Army, and get welfare checks done on these people. And if we have to, a district nurse might come out to check on them. They're often the things that people, I suppose, don't realise that we do.
As well as the joyous things like the weddings. And I want to pick up on something you said earlier. You also are in contact with the city's homeless people, perhaps more than any other service that we have. Can you tell us a little about what you've observed about the homeless? Is it better or worse? Are there more rough sleepers? What do we do to help them? What's their view of the world and what they want from us?
It's interesting. It comes in ebbs and flows. And I think in the 12 years that I've been here, it's sad to say, but the ebbs and flows often relate to what drugs are on the street, which can be really difficult to deal with. As a ranger approaching someone in a park to make sure that they're okay, you don't often know how they're going to react. And years ago, I might have been able to tell you how they're going to react, but now with the epidemic of ice, I must say that my staff now work in pairs in a lot more than they ever used to for their own welfare. As I said, we are in touch, almost daily with our homelessness team. So City of Melbourne have a dedicated homelessness team, which is fantastic. So we can ring them at any time to ask for their advice or assistance. And often that will result in the Salvation Army coming out to the park, sometimes within half an hour of us calling them. Often they'll say, yes, I know the person, I'm their caseworker, this is the details. We can get them accommodation now, which is sometimes lovely, or, we can get someone to come out and visit them. And people, a lot of the people we come across that we help, it might be their first time in Melbourne. They might have been sleeping rough for 3 nights, or they might have been sleeping rough for 5 years, and no one's asked them if they want help. A lot of the time the people that I meet will say, oh, I've just arrived from, Bendigo or Sydney, and I've had people cry and say, no one's ever offered me help, or no one's ever said, do you want my apple, do you want my sandwich, or... So every person that you meet is different, but 99.9% of them are genuinely chuffed that you've offered them some kind of assistance. And it's, it can be a really confronting thing to do as part of your job, but I actually find it's one of the more rewarding things, especially when you find out that, later on they've got accommodation and their life has turned around, and you do hear from them. They'll drop a note in at the town hall, or sometimes ring the hotline and get put through to you to say thank you, or, it can be an amazing experience. And it's quite amazing. I find that a lot of the homeless people will tell you what's happening in the parks and gardens as well, all sorts of interesting things that they've noticed, or sometimes, a few of them over the years have said, I'm going to look out for that rare and endangered owl that you always want to know about. And so they're also, I think the park rangers are our eyes and ears, but a lot of the time the homeless people are our eyes and ears as well.
You can tell the great Governor Charles Latrobe laid down those great gardens that are such a great gift to our city, but our park rangers do a lot more than take care just of those gardens. They also take care of the people who use those gardens, and some of them the most vulnerable. Could you thank Danielle, please? Could I turn now to Dan? Dan is an acting nurse unit manager. Can I tell you, a numb in a hospital is the real power of the hospital, despite what anyone tells you. I'm very proud to be the chairman of Melbourne Health, which includes the Royal Melbourne Hospital. Dan is in our hospital, and he cares for the most critically ill people, critically ill young people and their families. Dan, tell us a bit about what you do.
Well, firstly, I'm a nurse, a male nurse, which is always a funny concept. Why do they say a male nurse? Obviously, it's a female-dominated sort of industry, nursing, but my mates always say to me, "Why did you get into nursing? Why did you start it?" Because I guess I was like any boy, really involved in sports and footy, and really loved tinkering with cars, and I actually started vehicle engineering. And my mates are still surprised that I've decided to go into an industry like this, that deals with this kind of stuff. And I guess I'm amazed as well, but I wanted to be a paramedic when I first started, and my uncle said to me, "Don't do paramedics. They're confined to the state. You've got no opportunity. Go into nursing." And I went, "Oh yeah, I'll give that a crack." And I guess 13 years later, it's really been rewarding, and it's really looked after me. And as you said, as a nurse unit manager, I'm acting, and I've actually just stepped back down into my other position. My boss is here, and she dobbed me in today, so I've got her to thank. But no, we lead a very interesting group of people that do life-changing work.
Tell us about some of the critically ill people that you have to care for.
Yeah, so we operate a 24-bed intensive care unit. I don't know if anyone's been in an intensive care unit before, but the word intensive pretty much describes it. It's the sickest of the sickest people that need complex, life-saving care. You elaborated before about young people, and I guess that's where my heart and my passion is, specifically in trauma, because it is such a life-changing thing. That's something that is meant for travel, which is meant for enjoyment and can get you from A to B, can go so wrong, and it can actually tear families apart.
Maybe tell us a bit about the party program that you're involved in, Dan.
So on top of the fact that I'm also a manager, I also have passion in that area, because I think that prevention, like anything, is the best way of dealing with these issues. And the party program stands for Prevent Alcohol and Risk-Related Injury in Youth, or Trauma in Youth. And it's aimed at school-age children that are about to embark into adulthood. So they're about to get their licenses. They're about to grow up and start drinking, and maybe there's drugs out there, but maybe start to entertain that. And so we've got an opportunity to show them, I guess, what happens is when you do take risks in life, and when you step out into a car and maybe you drink before you do it, or even maybe you decide to speed or do something, try and show off to your mates, and that those choices can really change your life. And so we have an opportunity in ICU to bring in schools, and I think this started in Canada and came over to Australia and started in Perth, and we adopted it about 4 years ago. We saw a real need for it. And so we basically get school kids in and we show them families that their lives have been impacted. And so we have people that volunteer their loved one, or they'll come and chat to the kids, and they'll say that there's a ripple that occurs when someone makes a choice like this. They they themselves get injured and their life could be hanging in the balance, and I guess we don't know. Despite our best efforts, we might be able to save them. We might not be able to save them. We might be able to get them to a point where they're in a vegetative state, and that might be it. And so basically we tell the kids that, and we say, look, this is what happens as a result of choices you make. You know, you hop into a car after you've had alcohol, and you wrap your car around a tree. You might have a mate with you. You yourself might get injured, or you actually might physically or even kill your mate. And so we take them through that stuff. We show them the effects, and yeah, a lot of them say that it is life-changing for them, that they think twice. And I guess the biggest thing about it is that we say that now you've got the power to make good decisions going forward. You know that the risks that you're going to take in life, because everyone will take them, but having that foreknowledge that it could event or it could turn out that way, make them think twice, and maybe prevent a tragedy, prevent someone else's life. And we always say that as well. It might not be yourself. It might be someone else's life that you affect or that you cause damage to.
Dan, wonderful work, and we'd hope that you could intervene at a point with education where we didn't get to the hard work you do. But I want you to take us through now what happens when that helicopter lands on the roof of the Royal Melbourne. Someone in terrible trauma is brought down into accident and emergency, and in the emergency department is taken care of, and then critically ill is brought to you in intensive care. What happens to that person, and what sort of mode do you professionals go into to take care of that person? What are the things that you are doing that's running through your mind, that's your professional skill that you're applying to someone who's critically ill?
Yeah, well, all your training goes into action. I mean, it's a team response. So we all have roles, and we all get in there, and we all help, and we all have, you know, obviously you've heard of Dr. ABC. We get in there and we look danger, response, airway, breathing, circulation. We get in there and everyone takes a role. We have to ventilate the patient. You know, it depends on the type of trauma, but you know, they need stabilisation. They're usually, when you say critical, their heart rate, their blood pressure, everything's compromised. They could be bleeding. They could have lung injuries, and so we do the best we can to keep them alive. And so, yeah, sometimes that can take minutes, sometimes that can take hours, and sometimes that can take all day and even go into the next day. And I guess as a team, we do what needs to be done.
Tell us about your decision making. What informs those critical decisions at life and death moments?
Yeah. I guess your training just kicks in, and you just do what you need to do. You trust your colleagues, and you're all committed to doing the one task, and yeah, you just work systematically. Obviously, we know that without an airway, someone dies. So our sole prerogative is to make sure that airway is clear and patent, and that we're ventilating the patient. Then we move on to breathing. We make sure that they're able to breathe, that they're able to, they've got rise and fall in their chest. Then we move through systematically into their blood pressure, and so we just keep moving through those systems, you know, and then we go back, and then we go back again, and then we get bloods and we assess that, and then we go back again. And I guess it's repetitive, it's systematic, but we're always looking for what the problems might be, and then we solve them, and then we move on to the next. And
can I ask you, and maybe a tough question? You're not always going to save people who are critically compromised. How do you deal with the fact that you can do your best as a professional team, and yet you lose a patient dies under your care? How does that feel, if I may ask you, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's always I think the patient, it depends on the patient, to be honest with me. I know that everyone gets affected in different ways, and we all have life outside of our work, and so sometimes we bring life to work. But I think when you assimilate with someone at that same life stage as you, like I've got kids and I have a wife, but when you see someone that has a wife that's in that state, or themselves, they have kids, it's emotional, but it's a flight or fight response. So I think your training kicks in, you get in there and you do the job, and then when you can't do any more, collectively you make that choice. And yeah, it's something that you have to carry, and you really do need to have strong supports around you. You need to know how to unwind. You need to know how to let go and leave behind, but that's easier said than done. Some days it gets the best of you, and it's about the teamwork, and it's about the people around you that come around you and support you, and and it's important to debrief. It's important to talk about what we could have done and what we could have done differently, or if we could have done anything at all. So there are those times where you I guess you second guess yourself, but at the end of the day, if you've given your all, and we say that to our colleagues and to our staff and the younger nurses, if you've given your all, you need to be confident and know that you were there to support that person, even if they didn't survive, that you were able to give them the best shot, and you were there in that moment to support them and give them what they needed, and that goes for the family as well. Yes, we're there for the patients, but the patients have people attached to them. They have, some more than others. We have, the type of area we live in, there's lots of multicultural people, and so they have large families, and it's about not only dealing with that patient, but also their loved ones. And I guess as a nurse, you have lots of roles. You're looking after a patient. You're also a counsellor. You're also, you're listening. You're providing, a tissue. You're supportive. Your role doesn't stop. It keeps going.
It does. I'm very proud. You remember a few years ago a terrible tragedy in Flinders Lane where a gunman came out of a nightclub in King Street and shot a young man, Brendan Keelar, dead in Flinders Lane. And there was a young Dutch backpacker who went to the aid of that man, Paul de Waart. And Paul was also shot. Yeah. And he was brought to the Royal Melbourne. And he must be the luckiest young man alive. The theatres were ready. We were able to bring him into theatre. He had the best surgeons and nurses and teams working with him. When we brought him back, because he survived it, he didn't understand. We put him in a room, and there were 250 people in that room who had taken care of him. And there were another 35 who couldn't make it. And he was quite overwhelmed by the team that had wrapped around him and had saved that life. By the way, there was a husband and wife surgical team working on Paul, and they couldn't work out, in that wonderful terminology that surgeons use, why he was desanguinating, bleeding so much. One of the young surgeons reached into his open chest and closed off one of his major blood vessels so they could work out where that blood was coming from. And it was coming from another wound they hadn't picked up in his pelvis. And so they fixed that. And then in a heart-stopping moment, that surgeon opened her hand to allow the blood to flow again. And that young man lived because of people like Dan. Could you please thank Dan? Barry, can I go to you and just say, you're a master storyteller. That is your job in the media. You've just heard 3 remarkable stories. What is the role in public discourse for telling these stories, for getting them out there? I know it's great to interview the opposition leader on a Sunday morning when no one else has got him, and good on you for doing it, but how do we tell these sorts of stories through the media? Is there interest?
Oh, there absolutely is the interest. It's a question of breaking through the executive producers and the various media organisations. These things, again, tend to come in waves. If there's a sudden interest in medical practices, then you can pick it up. But I guess the way to try and penetrate it is through radio initially, because it's almost a bottomless pit with radio, and they love these kind of stories. At the top end, you get things like Australian Story on the ABC, which tells some wonderful stories of people, and occasionally the work that people do through the public service. But for mine, just sitting here tonight and listening to this is how people in the public service are prepared to go beyond the call of duty and like in Dan's case, talking about initiative, taking an initiative and doing other things. But with the Rangers, I just love the way that there seems to be a degree of autonomy so that they can decide in the field what is best for the organisation, what is best for the City of Melbourne, what is best in terms of the reputation that the Rangers have. And I don't know whether you have the autonomy to go pick the flowers whenever you want to and help out a tearful bride, but beyond that...
She does now, Barry. Don't worry about that.
But the initiative that you clearly show and the autonomy you seem to have to make judgments on the run and I'm sure in your case I'd have no hesitation of saying I'm sure those judgments would be impeccable. But it's that kind of dedication, I think, that comes with people in the public sector, that they are prepared to go above and beyond the call of duty.
Thank you. But I would love, if you have any questions for Tara, Danielle or Dan, for you to ask some questions now.
Terry, back in my day in the 60s, that the public servant, I remember that public servants weren't allowed to look out the window in the morning because they'd have nothing to do for the afternoon. But what I'm getting at, I'm disappointed that they've got stuck into the workforce and it has dropped so much, because I'd rather my tax dollar paid, like the government years ago used to pick up school leavers, so we didn't have high unemployment. So I'll leave that one with you.
Hang on, let's let Terry deal with that one first, because it's the question of whether the public service should be a major employer with that as a baseline, or whether inevitably it is going to shrink, and why. So, Terry.
So when I started my life as a public servant over 40 years ago in Canberra, I applied for 2 jobs, both in Canberra. They're the only jobs I applied for when I left university, and I quickly realised that in those days people like me were described as shiny bums, that they spent a lot of time sort of squirming in a seat and not achieving much. And I think it was unfair then, but it's got nothing much at all to do with the world that you've just heard described tonight. And when I've had the privilege of through my role in the Premier's Department and then in Prime Minister and Cabinet and by other means, seeing a great deal of high quality attitudes research over 30 years, I suppose. And there are some absolutely consistent messages in those episodes of attitudes research. Firstly, we are so different from America. People in Australia actually value the public sector and what it does. They want governments to address problems, and in many respects the responses in Australia to surveys which are also given in America flips the results. So in America it might be 20% being positive about government, and this is something I actually remember from the 80s. And 80% hostile to what government might do. In Australia, 80% of people at that time thought that there was a major role for government in contributing at least to most of the problems in our society, and only 20% against. And we're also different in terms of our attachment to religion. So it might go back to the Rum Corps, it might go back to the convict settlement, I don't know, but Australia's political culture and tradition is very, very different to that of America. But yet, many of the attitudes at a political level and at the level of many of the people, but not all engaged in policy, are these days, unlike when I started over 40 years ago, now influenced by prevailing sentiment in America. And one of the reasons, I think, why many of our politicians on both sides of politics are running up against the public is that they're talking a language that doesn't resonate with what, in its common sense, the public quietly thinks ought to be the case. Now, finishing on your reduction in proportion of the workforce, there are a whole lot of reasons for that, including IT and digital environment, but it's best seen as an indication of how the efficiency of the public sector has improved, and some parts have been sold off, like in Victoria, the electricity industry and the gas industry. But basically, Australia's outcomes in key areas like health and education are close to the best in the world. And yet, as a proportion of gross domestic product, America spends twice what we spend on health services, but gets lesser results. So there's something about the way Australia does things that's been working, and I'm most worried at the moment that it might get lost because people don't hear these stories and they don't understand that the connection which a myriad of public sector people have with the community is perhaps overshadowed by what we'll see tonight on the ABC at 8:30.
Barry, I'm going to ask you, as a spokesperson for the entirety of the Australian public and an insider, what do you think the Australian public's view as a whole of the public sector is? Is it respectful or is it scornful?
I think it's become more respectful over the years than when I can recall 30 or 40 years ago, that there was a sort of a regard for the public service, that there were a lot of loafers. There are a lot of loafers there, and I don't think that's the case anymore. I know that the ABC now, and we can sit back and complain all we like about the government saying that 1 in 10 has to go, or the ABC made that judgment, the government took away some money and the ABC had to find a way to deal with that, and they chose to go down that path that 1 in 10 lost their jobs. Now, we can complain about that and say that that's all sort of, it's politically motivated or whatever. The fact is that as a result of that, you do find ways to operate more efficiently. You have to. And it also opens up opportunities for others, because if 1 in 10 leave the organisation, there's a role there for somebody else to come in and at least fill that in part. I think that's been going on for quite a while through the public service, and they've been forced to this position in a sense. But I have no doubt that the regard for the public service now is far more positive than it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago.
Thank you. I'm delighted, by the way, that we've returned to Roman law. Decimation, 1 in 10, as I recall, was the rule of law in those days. But I'm not sure it should be applied entirely to the ABC. I know you've got another one, but I'll just ask if there's another question first before we come back to you again, if that's okay. Yep.
Thanks, Robert and Terry. Robert, you opened by asking how we value the public value of the public service. Governments can value it pretty easily. Do they get re-elected or not? Or politicians can value it pretty directly. Often, though, the
public never get it wrong, and politicians should remember that. They never get it wrong.
Absolutely, but let me say that there's another sort of element to it, and that's the contribution that the public sector might make to public debate. And there seems to me to be a challenge in reconciling the need for public servants to engage in public discussion, to bring their experience and knowledge to bear in the public discussions leading to policy development, and the desire of politicians to get to outcomes that will see them re-elected. Is my perception right, Terry?
Before we do, I mean, it's a great observation, but you would never expect Tara or Danielle or Dan to engage in that public debate, and yet they're the ones who do this stuff, which is something of an anomaly, I must say. But Terry, do you want to...
At the federal level in the Howard years, or up until the Howard years, it was the practice, and this was particularly evident in the Hawke-Keating years, for senior public servants to be authorised to brief journalists on a background basis on major reforms, so that the journalists better understood where things were going and could more reliably report what was happening, and that meant that Keating got his message out better than might have otherwise been the case on the very complex areas of economic reform. That all got closed down in the Howard years and totally disappeared in the Rudd and Gillard years, and is certainly not there under the current Prime Minister. So politicians decided that if there's only one channel, it's easier for them to control the messaging and achieve consistency. But there are still lots of senior figures occupying statutory offices who do speak and are entitled to speak as part of their role. Governor of the Reserve Bank, the Chief Executive of the PTV's on the radio talking about your new timetable this week. Police Commissioners talk, and Gillian Triggs. And the attack on Gillian Triggs by some is totally misplaced, because she has a valid view which, in keeping with the way in which her office was designed, she should be presenting, and she's doing Australia a service, in my view, in presenting it in the way that she does. And the attack upon her doing that in Q&A last week by a prominent federal politician was unwarranted and wrong, in fact as well as intent, and therefore we have to be careful that when people like Gillian Triggs do what sometimes needs to be done and says something that's unpopular, she's not attacked in a very vicious and personal way for doing that, but at least what she has to say is in some way dealt with through a rational discussion rather than dealt with by a personal and gratuitous attack on who she is and how she behaves. So there's a quality, or lack of quality perhaps, to part of the public discourse at the moment that I find deeply worrying. But when I look back over the history of Australian politics, everything goes in cycles. It'll shift because not only is the public always right in elections, Lord Mayor, the public's got a deep reservoir of common sense and can tell bullshit after a while and not reward it particularly well.
I must say, as a practicing politician, when an advisor or someone says to me something that makes me angry or particularly uncomfortable, it pays you well to listen very carefully. Very carefully. Do we have any further questions?
Thanks, Lord Mayor. The previous question, I think, alluded to the fact that advice about public policy coming through to politicians often comes from advisors and perhaps a department and so on. But I sense that the people such as our friends here who work every day at the coalface don't often get an opportunity, or their group, to influence decisions that are made about policy that affects their services and affects the public. And my background's education, and I think we've been seeing that over some decades, really, where the people at the front line, the teachers, the lecturers, the trainers, their voices seem to be more and more isolated. Policies often made in ignorance, really, of some of the real world issues that they're facing.
Can I throw then to Tara, Danielle, or Dan? Can you give us your perspective on that? A time when you thought from your front line that you either did or did not influence a policy decision that was important?
So I'm happy to
Tara, yep.
start. So I've spent the last 7 months of my life writing briefs at all hours of the morning and night to our minister, giving advice. So I feel like I have a very strong and direct influence over our public transport network and proposed changes. And I'm privileged to be in that position, and I'm working with the Minister's office to help them understand the complexity of the changes that Melbourne is facing and how we can best work through that to get the best outcome. So I think it depends on perhaps which agency, which department and what kind of role you're in. But in my case, I've certainly written and been involved in compiling a significant amount of advice to make sure that our minister is the best informed and that she can make the best decisions for Victoria.
Danielle or Dan, do you want to make a quick comment? Up to you.
I must say, actually, I often feel really privileged that I've been asked to assist when the City of Melbourne are making new policies. I think partially it becomes from having worked there for so long that you get to know so many people who know you've got something to say, so they ask you. But I must say, we do a massive amount of public consultation on all of our policies, and I suppose I'm lucky enough that I do meet people on a daily basis out in the parks that I can say to them if they've got an issue, have you heard that we are consulting on this policy? Or I can actively go out and seek people out and say to them, you are the sort of person that we need to fill out our online survey, for example. So whether it's something as big as a urban forest policy, or something like the master plan for Carlton Gardens, which is World Heritage listed, and a lot of people had a lot of say on that. The general public had a lot of say on those sorts of things. Our homelessness policy, anybody can get involved, and I think it's part of my role is letting people know that. So whenever people come to you with an issue or a problem or a comment, we can steer them in the right direction and not always say, email the Lord Mayor, he can help you.
Yeah, good policy.
I sometimes do that, though, I must say.
Very, very good policy, Danielle.
Or email the CEO or the head of this department can help you.
That's okay.
We prefer to be, well, that's true.
Yeah.
But we prefer to be able to say, we will put you in touch with the right person, or there is going to be consultation on this policy. And it's great to be able to see changes. I suppose having worked there long enough, I can see changes that have been made that have sometimes been positive and sometimes been negative.
Dan,
but
do you want to throw something in, Dan? You don't have to.
No, I think it's controversial. I think that, obviously, as you said, some changes are positive or have an overall positive thing, but can be viewed negatively from those workers at the time. And I think, like anything, sometimes we work through it, we understand the reasons behind it, the bigger picture. It can make more sense, but in the moment, it's a change. And I think you said change agents. Change is tough, and sometimes it's about embracing change and how you support change. I think if you understand the bigger picture, it makes more sense. But understanding the bigger picture can sometimes be the hardest thing to get across.
Why don't we have the train we don't have to Tullamarine? Was that because of the contract with CityLink that was signed?
No.
And also my dream is...
No. That is a very good question, and it's a very good answer. And someday, this city, which is the only city in the world of its size and sophistication which doesn't have a rail link to the airport, will actually make the decision to bloody well have one, and we should get on with it. Anyway, could I ask us to round out tonight by asking Terry Moran to just round out some observations of tonight and the notion of public service, which is what we're here to talk about. Terry.
Thanks, Lord Mayor. Well, from these stories and from many other stories that could be told, one can readily see that what public sector workers, public servants do affect the lives of people in the community, and indeed, in many respects, the prospects that our community will have. Whether Melbourne works or not is basically a function of whether the City of Melbourne and the state government can work together to do a myriad of things that make Melbourne what it is. So there remains a very constructive role for the public sector. And when I listen to the stories of connection and compassion from the three people from entirely different circumstances, I realise that, and this is not meant to be nasty about any of the outsourced service delivery, you can't write contracts to get people to do work like that. You can instill it in professionals, as you would into a nurse, but even there, public hospitals have a reputation for going that extra mile, particularly in circumstances of trauma or response to trauma, that often pays dividends in terms of saving lives or avoiding some of the injury. And so I think that the public still gets the idea that public servants, people working in myriads of occupations within the public sector, do something that's valid and valuable and different from what you can expect if the function is outsourced to contractors. So I'm not totally against outsourcing services, but I think that the stories you hear tonight would be very hard to extract from many of the people who are working in companies for profit, where the money is paid by government to get some services delivered. And whether the trains and trams work on time, in effect, is ultimately to do with how public servants can manage the timetables and how the different systems work together. The other points that I'd make would be summaries of what I think is what is still important at the heart of the public sector in Australia. The surveys speak about honesty and integrity, which can be a way of describing trust, but that is important because that's the basis of the continuing confidence that the community has in public servants. And people working in the public sector have to be consciously on the ball on the honesty and integrity issue, and as is the case with a small part of the education department in Victoria at the moment, conscious that when a group goes off the rails, they're nuked to the extent that they deserve it, and the system is improved and repaired so it can't happen again. Secondly, people in the public sector have to be impartial. If you're a nurse in an intensive care unit, you've got to treat all patients as well as you can to your professional ability. You can't turn away from some patient because that patient has some characteristic that you don't like or approve of. You've got to treat all people with impartiality and without any overly negative or even for that matter overly positive views of them as justifying or not justifying your attention. And this also contributes to a sense that people can get a fair go out of the institutions that the public sector operates. People in the public sector have to be there because of a meritocratic process. That's fallen down a bit in some cases in recent times, but we've always got to be conscious that it's part of what was established in Victoria in the 19th century, when the public service here was established well before there was an Australian public service. It was established on the basis of what are called the Northcote-Trevelyan reforms from the UK, which emphasised merit, and interestingly, that had less impact on New South Wales than here. Queensland was the other state that went the same path as Victoria and embraced the Northcote-Trevelyan report in forming up its public sector. The other message that I got out of tonight was how important it is for people to always be conscious of being connected with and concerned with the community that they encounter, whether it's in a school or in a hospital or in a community setting or in a park or in going out and visiting lots of train stations and answering people's questions about the timetable that is still to be perfect, but soon will be. It's that connection which forges the links with the community that, again, you can't necessarily write this into a contract with an outsourced provider. So I get the sense that our system is evolving to the point, in part because we're putting so much more authority at the local level. So Robert Doyle, as Chair of Melbourne Health, and all the people who work in Melbourne Health have now got more unimpeded capacity to decide to do things and to do them in an innovative way and continually improve the services, where 20 or 30 years ago they would have been going all the time to a central bureaucracy asking for stuff to be ticked off. And if you give people that freedom, if they're properly trained, if their values are right, if they're in touch with the community, in touch with the people who are coming through their door, they will respond well, be innovative, not waste money, and do good services. And that, for me, is the message from tonight.
And finally, it just remains to thank two of the senior people in the conversation that so characterises Melbourne, Barry Cassidy and Terry Moran. Thank you very much for your contribution. But in particular, can I thank not just for their time, but for their wonderful stories, Tara, Danielle and Dan.